In this video, I want to go over how I managed to create this explosion animation. And there's 3 times that I want to do that. It's when the player shoots a drone, of course, when one of the drones manages to shoot the player, or when the player and one of the drones collide. And in each case, so whenever a collision happens, that's when we want to show this explosion animation. So what is an animation? Let's start with that first of all. We'll go big picture, and then we'll zoom in on some of the details. An animation is really just going through a series of images, and we have 11 in this case, that when we cycle through them fast enough, we have to go fast enough, it looks like it's an explosion. It's animated. So big picture, we have, at the very least, we start with this explosion struct. So I created a new struct to keep track of the explosion. And an explosion consists of deciding where it goes on the screen. Just zoom in here. Where it goes, what image are we showing? So out of the 11, what image are we showing? So we have a frame, which is just an integer that points to an index in an array of textures. So we'll load our 11 textures, and for each explosion, we reference one of those textures in the frame so we can cycle through them, go through them one at a time in order, and show our animation. And then we don't want to go through one explosion frame per game frame because then it'll just happen way too quickly. We instead want to implement some sort of timer so that each frame would last a certain number of game frames, or I should say loops, our game loops, so that we show it at the speed that we want. So let's start at the beginning where we have an explosion happening, and we'll kind of work our way back, and we'll highlight the things that we need to make it happen. The first explosion would be where a player's laser collides with one of the drones. So here, you'll remember in our first check in our update and render section, we go through our player lasers, and if the laser is active, then we check for collisions with a drone. And so when there is a collision, we kill the drone, we kill the laser here by resetting their health to 0. That means that in later checks, we won't render them because their health is 0. But then we want to also create a new explosion. And how do we keep track of these explosions? Well, just like we keep track of lasers and drones with an array, so we cycle through these arrays, and when we spawn a new drone, for example, we find the first drone that's available, and then we render it on the screen. We reset its position, and we re-render it. We're going to have an array of explosions. Some of these explosions will be active, so like the red one here, and some of them will be inactive. When a new explosion happens, we want to find the first one that is inactive, and then we're going to reactivate it. And when we reactivate it, we reset its fields so that it shows where we want it to show, etc. So the explosion needs to happen. It needs to be positioned at the XY to match the entity that was destroyed. So let's say it's a drone. We want it to render exactly where the drone used to be. The drone is no longer being rendered, but we want to render an explosion in its place. What I do here is I set the position slightly up to the left and up because we want the explosion to be centered on where the entity happened. So if you look at the game carefully here, that when we destroy a drone, then the explosion happens right where the drone used to be. If we didn't use the height and the width of the explosion image and offset it a bit by half to the left and up, then it would look like the explosion is happening down and to the right of where the drone used to be. You see, because the explosion is quite large, we want it centered, we don't want it to shift to the right. It would look kind of funny. So you can play around with that yourself actually. Just remove the divide by 2s here and you can see what it would look like otherwise. Next, I want the explosions to have a delta X. We want the explosions to move. We don't want them to be in the same place every time we render the frame. You see, every time we render the image, we want it to move slightly to the left. And we want it to move to the left based on the delta X of the entity that's being destroyed. I mean, if you look at the drones, they're all moving at different speeds. They all have a different delta X. And I want the speed of the explosion to match the speed at which the drones were moving. Then, of course, we reset active to true. We reset the frame. The first frame that we want to show is the first image, so we set it to 0, and then we reset our timer. And then at the end of our update and render section, This is where we will iterate through them, as I said, and every active explosion, that's what we're going to render. So let's go back to here. If our explosion is active, well, first we check to see what frame we're at. If we're at the 11th frame or higher, that means that we're outside of our array of textures right here. We've gone through all of the textures, so we set the explosion to false again. We're no longer rendering it, right? But if we're still active, so we're still within our bounds of our textures array, then we'll grab the texture that we're currently at. We look at our current frame. We grab our texture. We reset its position, so we update its position based on the delta motion of the dx, the delta x of the explosion. And I divide it by 3 because I want the explosion to move just slightly slower than the original entity. You can play around with this and get the effect you like. I kind of liked the way it looked when I did the divide by 3. And then I render it. Now, I pass in nil again. I don't need a source destination rect. You recall from previous videos that if we just use the full image, then we can just pass in nil. We don't have to carve out a certain piece. Then we decrement our timer. Now, the timer that I've set is up at the top in a constant here. The timer, I want each frame in our explosion, so each image in the explosion array to show for 4 frames. Our target delta time is a single frame, game loop, and I want to multiply that by 4, so it lasts for 4 frames. You can lower this number, of course, to have a faster animation, or increase it if you want a slower animation. So I decrement that, and once we get to the end of our timer, that's where we'll reset our timer again, and then increment which frame we're on. We want to move to the next frame. So we start at the first one, and then after the timer, after our 4 game loops, we switch to the next one. After 4 more, we switch to the next one, and that's how we get our animation. Now, where else are we showing these? Where else are we exploding things? So we call explode whenever the player's laser hits a drone. So we have this right here. We explode the drone. We destroy it. Next, we want to also check when a drone laser collides with a player. Now, I actually had to check for where the player's health is still above 0. That means the player is still displayed on the screen. You'll recall that once the player is destroyed, the scene continues to play for a few seconds, and we want to make sure that we're not continuing to check for collisions even after the player is no longer rendered. So I check for that collision, and after destroying the laser, the drone laser, and the game player, we want to explode the player. We want to destroy it and show the animation. And the final one is when the player actually collides with one of the drones. So when we're going through our drones, we've respawned our new drones, we've checked for health, right? And we've checked for collisions right here. We also want to check for a player-drone collision only if the player is alive still, if he's still being rendered on the screen. And if there's a collision, we destroy the drone, of course, we destroy the player, and we explode both of them. We show an explosion animation where both of them were. So we end up with 2 explosions instead of just the 1. See if I can collide with one. You can see that. There we go. We've got 2. So if you want to learn more about this animation stuff, I find it really interesting. This is just the way that I figured out how to do it. I've also done it slightly differently in other videos where I animate a character walking around the screen. And that one's interesting because I don't use the entire image. It's a sprite sheet, so I have to change the source destination rect, or sorry, the source rect, as well as the destination. So when I render copy, the full animation, I have to change both the source rect and the destination rect right here. So instead of just passing in nil, I have to pass in 2 rects. So that one's interesting, and I'll link to that in the comments and in the description. You can check that out. Thanks very much for tuning in, and in the next video, stay tuned for that. I'm going to go over how I did the scrolling background to give this illusion of traveling through space.